On behalf of Festival co-directors Nabitha Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to GLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed yesterday's session with Pavan K. Verma, Shashi Tharoor on the greatest ode to Lord Ram, and Vidya Shah and Catherine Schofield on Indian classical music, and our earlier sessions featuring a really brilliant list of speakers, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Piku Iyer, Margaret Atwood, Oran Pamuk, Shashi Tharoor, and so many others. You can view these on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our first session today is Good Omens, Neil Gaiman in conversation with Nilanjana S. Roy. Neil Gaiman is a New York Times best-selling author of short fiction, novels, comic books, graphic novels, audio theater, and films. His award-winning titles include Norse Mythology, American Gods, The Graveyard Book, Good Omens, and the Sandman graphic novels. Several of his works have been adapted for theater, TV, and film. Good Omens, which he adapted and showran, has won several awards. He's also amongst the most popular writers in the world and has a huge fan following in India. Here he talks to fan Nilanjana S. Roy about his life and work and how he's surviving under lockdown. Nilanjana S. Roy is the author of the award-winning fantasy novels, The Wildings and the 100 Names of Darkness, and writes a regular column on books for the Financial Times. She has edited several anthologies, a collection of essays on reading titled The Girl Who Ate Books, and has just finished her third novel, Black River. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below, and we will pass them on to Nilanjana to ask Neil. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, as we normally do, we'll be right back. Stay there on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, Good Omens, Neil Gaiman, in conversation with Nilanjana S. Roy.
It's so wonderful to have you with us today, Neil. We've only been waiting 32 years ever since Sandman came out for you to get to India, and it feels like we're inching just a little bit closer to goal.
It's definitely frustrating for me in that India now feels like this sort of El Dorado or Hy Brasail. It's become this mythical place that I really want to get to because somewhere along the way, I managed to get to everywhere else that I wanted to go and meet my readers. I got to Brazil and I got to the Philippines and I got to China and I got to Moscow. I got to these places, and then India is always one step away.
I can almost hear the sound of a million hearts breaking that you went there before you came here. But I'm hoping that there's going to be an after times. You know, we're right now not just in the before times, but in the during times of the pandemic. And it's been such an extraordinary year, hasn't it, Neil? It feels like it's not just the pandemic, but it feels like there's been protests over race, over religion, over so many of the old issues coming back again. And in the middle of that, I was just wondering, we were just talking before we started about how you'd managed to get to Skye, an island near Scotland, and now you find yourself more or less marooned there with no clue about when you're going to get off the island. And in these circumstances, has it been possible for you to write? I mean, is there a huge creative burst, or is it actually hard to concentrate?
It's much harder, except very, very slowly, I'm getting things done. I finished an introduction that was 2 years late, and then I finished an introduction that was either 4 years late or 32, 33, 34 years late, and actually wound up including in it material that I had written when I was 22 for an article that I never wound up writing, which was amazing. And then last week, I wrote my first fiction for a long time. I was asked to do a story for a Doctor Who charity book that's coming out, that is collecting the Doctor Who material that's already been generated during lockdown, because lots of wonderful people, Chris Chibnall, Stephen Moffat, obviously Russell T Davies, have come in and created stuff. I did a little thing called Rory's Story, just done for Doctor Who fans. And they came back and said, would I do a short story to go in the anthology? And because it was a charity project, because nobody was waiting, because it didn't matter if I did it or I didn't, nobody would know, nobody would care, I found it intensely liberating. And I spent the next 3 days and wrote a short story, and it was done. And I thought, oh, I can still do this. I thought maybe I couldn't, but actually I can. And that was enormously healing. And apart from that, there's a lot of the usual stuff that one has to do. There's proofreading, copy editing, planning. There's a lot of planning for what we're doing when lockdown finishes. A lot of things that a pause button was pressed on. And they don't, some of them stop and some of them don't exactly stop. Bits of things stop, but other bits keep going.
It has been a busy time for you. You've had a lot of, I was just looking at your calendar for the last couple of years, and you've been saying plaintively from 2018 that you want to write a novel. And I'm hoping that this piece of fiction, is the first plunge back into that pool.
That's very much what I'm hoping. It's very weird for me because I have a novel that I'm 5 chapters in on. I love it. And I'm trying to get enough of a sense of what the world is this year to know whether I'm going to set it in the past, whether I'm going to set it in 2019, or whether I'm just going to write the novel and let it cope. That's the next Neverwhere book.
Oh my God, that's so exciting. But
and a lot of that is about what it reflects. I mean, there were themes that are very much today's themes that were already in there, in terms of refugees, in terms of, Neverwhere is a way of talking about the displaced, the dispossessed, the people who are forced out of their places and forced to live on the margins. So it seemed a very good place to write and to tackle those themes. Now I'm just trying to figure out what goes into that book.
But it seems as though it's written almost into the moment. What we've seen in India for the last few weeks after lockdown was the sight of people who've been newly turned migrants, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
People who are not yet, we hope never, full-time refugees. But it seems almost as though across the world, this is happening. And what better time to tell this story than now?
I think the thing that I really feel that people are starting to get a sense of now is the thing that I started to understand 6 or 7 years ago when I started working with refugees. And today, by the way, is World Refugee Day, which was talking to Syrian refugees in Jordan. What I had not understood before was how normal their lives had been before they became refugees. They were us. They owned corner shops, and they were farmers, and they worked in car sales rooms, and they sold insurance, and they lived normal lives in normal cities and normal towns and normal villages, and then it all fell apart. And realizing then how incredibly fragile civilization is was something that I simply hadn't understood. I took civilization for granted. I hadn't realized that all it takes to destroy a village is to drive a tank through the middle of the village, down the main street, and every water pipe underneath gets crushed, and now the village has no water, and now they're going down to the swamp and trying to get water from the swamp. And you're going, this is so fragile. And that, I think, if there is a lesson to be learned from so far in 2020, it's just this thing we're in is really fragile. It can break really easily. I'm watching things like theater. You know, I'm involved in and working on several theater projects. Ocean at the End of the Lane was at the National Theatre at the end of last year, beginning of this one, and it was meant to be transferring to the West End because it was a huge hit. And now we're going, well, what does that mean? Can we do that? How can we do that? I was meant to be working on a play for New York's Public Theatre. And right now I'm trying to work out a way that you can put on a play that can be socially distanced, can be safe. You know, am I going to, instead of putting people in a theater, am I going to take 100 people a night and walk them around Central Park in masks? Actually, that might be a really good way to do it.
It's a time, what you feel in your skin pretty much is that it's a time of such waves of turbulence around the world that it becomes all the more important to have the storytellers. When you were talking about your experience in Syria and how that changed you, I was thinking about how a journalist called Paul Salovek, who's been walking around the world for years, when he writes about refugees, he says, we can't distance, you know, we have to bring down the barriers. We cannot continue to write about people as though they are at a safe remove from us, and we cannot look down. And one of the things that you've done with your fiction before in many different ways, it started with Sandman, maybe with the Ramadan issue, I remember that very well, was you connect across, you just look at the human story, you know, and you also are able to say, or at least fiction is able to say, that is us, that is our story, or it could be our story. Not just that the security that we take for granted is no longer there, but I think what you're trying to say is that that security and that peace should be there, right? And that it is.
I would love to give that peace and that security to everybody. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that fiction gives us, one of the things that I took from fiction, was the realization that I was not alone and that not everybody was like me, and that we are all connected. It was one of the things that I took from reading science fiction as a kid, was the idea that a person is a person, and you can have green skin and tendrils and you're still a person, and you could be a sentient planet and you're still a person. It gives you the ability to look out of other people's eyes. And I think that for me has always been really important. And I know that, you know, for me, writing is a continuous process of failure. You try and do something brilliant, and if you manage something good, that's okay. Maybe next time you'll do the brilliant thing, but you keep trying. And I want kids, I want adults, I want people to use my fiction where I can to connect and to look out of eyes that are not theirs, and to understand that they can do that too, that, you know, you can be a writer as well. And also, one thing that I've been trying to do for years in essays and introductions, which was why I was so pleased a few years ago to do a book called The View from the Cheap Seats, which was a collection of that stuff, which is just to point people at authors and works and places that I love. Almost to say, look, you don't have to love these things, but this is something that I love and this is why I love it, and let me shine a light onto it. And maybe it's something, you know, if you want to start a reading list, if you want to go and explore, if you like something that I do, well, maybe you'll like this thing. And I love to be able to do that too.
Neil, I have 4 questions coming out of this. I'm more or less throwing away the questions that I'd started off with, and let's just have a conversation about this. But let's start with what fantasy can do, you know, which is something that I think you, Terry Pratchett, many of the people who are writing today are really, really working to bridge this empathy gap, you know, this inability to see into a world that is not ours. And I remember thinking years ago that one of the reasons why Terry Pratchett's books was so powerful was that behind the fun and, you know, the great world building and everything, he was writing with a tremendous anger, and not a despairing anger, but an anger that was fueled by a thirst for change, you know, saying our world is not in the shape that it should be. Discrimination should not be happening the way it is. And you wrote not necessarily with that same searing anger, but a lot of what you were writing about, from Sandman to American Gods to a lot of the other books, was also about looking at injustice, looking at tyranny, looking at freedom. And particularly, you know, right from the start, whatever you were doing, whether it was comics or whether it was novels or short stories or films, you've been preoccupied by the question of who has freedom and who doesn't, you know, freedom in their lives or freedom in a fantasy world. And do you think this is one of the gifts of fantasy, really? I know that mainstream critics often don't see this. They think of fantasy as something that's escapist. But it is the oldest form of storytelling that we have, and it has power to it.
Oh, you have touched on so many big important things in your question. I'm going to miss things out while I answer. But first of all, Terry Pratchett, absolutely, that anger, fury, righteous indignation drove Terry. And what also drove him was knowing that one of the things that fantasy does best is taking something that you know, you've always seen it from this angle, and then turning it around so you're seeing it from this angle, and you're not seeing the thing that you're used to. Taking reality and allowing you to lose preconceptions because you may think that you don't like this kind of person. But actually, here's the story with this kind of person. You may think that the problem with the poor is that they just don't work hard enough because you've worked hard and you're rich and so on and so forth. And then you get Terry writing about boots from the point of view of Vimes, his sort of police captain in the City Watch, and just thinking about the fact that if you can afford a good pair of boots, that good pair of boots will last you the rest of your life. But if you can't afford a good pair of boots, you're going to get a pair of boots with cardboard soles that are going to wear out after a couple of years. And then you're going to have to get another pair of boots and another pair of boots. And actually, if you'd had the money, you would have saved a lot of money, and it's expensive being poor. And Terry puts it in a way that actually means that you read that and you go, oh, that actually changes the way that I viewed poverty, because yes, it's really expensive being poor. The poor get to pay more for stuff. Terry would write about racism. Terry would write about things that made him angry in the world. I wish that Terry was alive right now, and I wish that he hadn't had Alzheimer's, and I wish that his fury and anger could be with us today, because I would love to see what he would make of the governments, of the tech world, of the foolishness of people. And I know that he would phrase things in ways that would just change people's minds, because that was part of Terry's power. When we wrote Good Omens, we wrote about stuff that we were upset about or concerned about 31 years ago. And the weirdest thing with Good Omens was it came out last year. It came out as a TV series almost exactly a year ago, tiny bit over a year ago. And we had people asking us if we changed it to become timely, because here was stuff about war, here was stuff about, there was pollution stuff in there, there was a lot of environmental stuff, there was killing whales, there was, it all seemed incredibly timely. And we're like, no, all of this really timely stuff is 31 years old. It's just the world has got worse. The one huge thing that we missed, of course, was we have a joke in Good Omens about how pestilence, plague, had retired in 1933, making way for pollution.
And he's out of retirement, is he?
Absolutely, out of retirement, and making us all realize that no, it never gone away.
Two linked questions out here. One of the things you've always said is that if we can only imagine better, if we can only bend, and you take that very seriously, you don't think that it's just writers or readers who should do it. You really think that governments and big tech and everybody should do it. We should really try to imagine a better world. And so
I think that's the only way we're going to get to a better world. I mean, especially right now. You look at the mess that we're in right now, and nobody else is going to fix it. Our governments are not going to fix it. Which means that we as people, we as citizens of this planet, have to demand better. And that also means that we have to educate ourselves. It means we have to imagine what kind of world we want to live in. And we have to demand that world. And we have to also figure out how you get there. Worlds change because people change. People make decisions, people act on those decisions. And right now, we're in a mess. In America, there are states right now with incredibly high COVID rates where the people are talking about, that they don't wear masks.
And like the fictions that a lot of people choose to believe right now are dangerous fictions.
There are definitely dangerous fictions. And dangerous fictions because simplicity can be easier. Comforting lies can be much easier to live with than hard facts. And I was lucky. I was in New Zealand when they went into lockdown, and they went into lockdown early. And some people were very, very grumpy about them going into lockdown early. They went in before a lot of other places did. And yet, they're going into lockdown, and what they did means that New Zealand is basically a COVID-free place right now. and life there has gone back to normal. You know, my wife this morning went out to the local farmers market and played her ukulele there because she missed with our son, because she missed performing for people. So she just decided to busk at the farmers market. And I love that she can do that, because there are a lot of places in the world where either that would be impossible to do, or it would be really stupid to do. And in New Zealand, it is both possible and safe.
And just to ask, as a writer yourself, you've written several rules for writers, and one of them was something I was thinking about in this time, which is the one about do the things, make your mistakes, do the things that scare you. We said this as a joke just before this conversation. There's an Indian writer called Samit Basu who said, "Oh, please ask Neil Gaiman whether the rules for writers change post-pandemic."
Oh,
But
God,
then,
no.
that question becomes a lot more serious given what we are discussing. What would you say to writers? How do you imagine beyond this time? How do you address this?
I think so I would say in pandemic, all of the rules for writers that I wrote, my 8 rules, are still all true, but I would add one more, which is just be kind to yourself and be forgiving of yourself. Because so many writers that I know, including me, have gone, all I need is time and space. Wouldn't it be great if I were just locked in a room and I didn't have to worry about anything and I could get so-and-so written, and I've got all this stuff to get written and now I can get it written. And actually, a lot of the time, no, you can't. You are in full-on sort of anxious fight or flight mode. It's getting to the place in your head where you create is hard. And creating a world for yourself in which you can make things is hard. So in addition to all of the rules, just write, finish what you write, all of that kind of stuff, I would say, and just be kind to yourself.
And Neil, you just received the proofs of a book that you'd written as a story to tell your son, who's unfortunately not with you right now. But do you want to show us what?
It's actually covered in little Post-it notes. So this is what a book looks like, a children's book, when it arrives from the printer. These are proofs. And I don't have the cover yet. The cover was meant to arrive yesterday, but the printer in Hong Kong got confused. And instead of sending me the cover of my book, they sent me 2 copies of Jamie Oliver's next cookbook, which is apparently under embargo and very secret. And everybody got very upset when I said, I've got 2 copies of Jamie Oliver's next cookbook here. And Jamie Oliver is probably sitting somewhere looking at the cover of my book, Pirate Stew, going, why have I been sent this? But this is the insides of Pirate Stew by me and Chris Riddell. And although I wrote it for my son Ash, I've actually dedicated it over there to my grandchildren, Myra and Sterling. And it's this thing, it's beautifully illustrated by Chris Riddell. It's about a mum and dad who go out and get a pirate in as a babysitter. There we go. Long John McRon, ship's cook, becomes a pirate babysitter. And of course, very, very soon, he brings in a whole lot more pirates, because you would, wouldn't you, on babysitting. And then they make the kids pirate stew, which is...
I'm totally down with
to feed the kids It's difficult to choose, said one. Impossible, began another. We have to feed 'em, Long John said. I told their father and their mother. We pirates always keeps our word. At that each pirate nodded head, and so they thoughtfully conferred. Beans on toast? No beans, no bread. Or scrambled eggs? Too complicated. Spaghetti? Looks like worms, one said. Old Long John thought. He hesitated. He said, me hearties, this is true. We ought to do what pirates do. We ought to make a pirate stew. And they make pirate stew. And what happens as a result of the pirate stew and is a saga involving ships and donuts and adventure. And so much fun. Chris Riddell is absolutely brilliant. I've been so fortunate in having a career where I get to work with artists whose work I love. As a young man, I had Dave McKean as an artist, Dave doing all the covers of Sandman, doing book covers, doing book illustrations. For the last few years, since 2008, I've had Chris Riddell in my life drawing my stuff. We just had a Melbourne artist, an Australian artist, Elise Hurst, do this beautiful illustrated edition of The Ocean at the End of the Lane. That is so heartbreakingly gorgeous. Just very lucky.
And you love slipping into the skin of a child. I mean, it's almost as though you can go back there again. You find it easy. Do you find it easy to imagine yourself back to that time when you're 2 or 8? And
yes. When I was a kid, I remember reading books as a kid by adults who obviously didn't remember. And just getting angry with them. I was like, why are you writing this story? You have no idea what it's like to be a kid. And you shouldn't be writing this, and this is wrong. And I promised myself I wouldn't forget. And I think, you know, I mean, the weirdest thing, of course, for me right now is it's very easy to slip into the skin of a kid who is my kind of, you know, who was living when I was a kid. I think it would be much harder for me to do the thing of writing a contemporary kid and actually having to get it right. To write a kid also navigating a world of, you know, text messaging, influences, and cyberbullying. It's not that I couldn't do it, but it's like, okay, that then demands extrapolation, whereas the other way just demands memory.
that brings me to, I think I have time for just one last question before we hand over to the audience. And I'm hoping that people who are listening to this chat will come in with all the things I wanted to ask you about, you know, about adaptations and about Sandman coming out and what you want to work on next. But just staying with children, it is such an intense time to be a child, isn't it? I mean, in addition to the fact that childhood itself got complicated, you're also looking at this unnerving thing where people are being openly racist, where even somebody with imagination might be, you know, transphobic or something. And you're looking for guidelines. And do you still find those? Do you think children still find those in stories and myths and fairy tales? Or do you think there's something else that you would say, go and look for?
I think that what you find is going to be there. And I think that none of us should ever make the mistake of confusing the author, including me, with the work that we make, because the work is the best of us. If you are inspired by an author who turns out in real life to have done something awful, or have thought something awful, or to have espoused something awful, that doesn't mean that you were wrong in finding beauty or truth in what they wrote, or finding comfort in what they wrote. Because that comfort was there and you found it, and it's a good thing. And, you know, a trans kid who finds a fiction that allows them to feel embraced, who then discovers that the author is transphobic or whatever, doesn't make less of the fiction that you love, or the comfort that you found, or the bravery or inspiration that you found in the field. It just means that people are imperfect, and all people are imperfect. That's one of the things about being a person. We are all of us flawed. We're all of us screwed up. But you know, very often the books are where you'll find the best of us, and the stories are where you'll find the best of us.
That's a beautiful note on which to close. And just a quick question. You say it so often, but why is kindness so important for writers? Everyone else says, work hard, or they say, nurture your talent, or, you know, grow your imagination, or write what you know, or write what you don't know. And you've said this consistently for 20, 30 years. Be kind. Why does it matter for writers and readers?
You know, because there's lots of other people out there saying the other stuff, and there aren't enough people saying be kind. And when I'm on my deathbed, I cannot imagine myself lying there going, I wish I'd worked a little bit harder. I wish I'd written that one extra book. I wish I'd done this. I wish I'd done that. But I can absolutely imagine myself going, I just wish I'd been kinder. And also because I think right now it matters so much, because anger is an easy thing to stir up. Outrage is a really, really easy thing to stir up. You can point at people will gather together and they will throw rocks, and, you know, they will burn temples, and they will... I read a thing this morning that actually made me cry. There were photographs of a 14-year-old kid in America, a 14-year-old black kid who was executed, sent to the electric chair for a crime that he swore he had not committed and had not committed. And, you know, essentially was executed, was murdered by the state. And you're just looking at these photos, and you're thinking things like this are so easy, and kindness and empathy and forgiveness are so hard. And those are the things that we have to find in ourselves if we are going to move on as human beings. Which does not mean you cannot be righteously outraged. Righteous outrage is one of the best things in the world. It doesn't mean that you can't look around and go, this thing is wrong, I'm going to change this, and I'm going to work with other people to change this. You should. But it also means that kindness and empathy have to be tools and have to be there for all of us. Otherwise, we will live in an atmosphere of outrage forever, trying to find our targets for our 15 minutes of hate.
Thank you so much for saying this, Neil. And thank you for Dream, and for Death, Shadow, and for Mr. Punch, and for all of them. I'm just going to bring in a few questions from the audience. I wish we had more time, but I hope...
I have to come here. People ask me questions in the flesh.
Yes. Okay, this is from Deepika, who says, while I love the Sandman series, it was the Graveyard book that really touched a chord, so much so I brought it in as the novel study component of the school I was teaching at. What I want to know is, were you at all inspired by the Jungle Book when you wrote the Graveyard book?
So I remember the moment that I came up with the idea of the Graveyard book, because my son, who was now 37, was 2, and he was cycling around the little graveyard across the lane from where we were living on his tricycle. And he looked so at home, and I thought, I could do a story like this. I would do a story about a kid who was raised by dead people in a graveyard. And then I thought, well, kind of like the Jungle Book, I guess. The nearest equation to that is the Jungle Book, with a kid being raised by wild animals, learning the things that wild animals know. I would be writing about a kid raised in a graveyard, learning the things that dead people know. So I decided that when I wrote the book, I would do it as a kind of a conversation with the Jungle Book, which meant that it wouldn't be a traditional novel. I would do it as a set of short stories, because Kipling's Jungle Book stories, the story of Mowgli, they are short stories. They sort of, you'd have to put them together to form a novel. So I thought, okay, I can do that. I'll do one story every 2 years. And I will do things where you can see the connections. You'll see how something works. You'll be able to look at a story. For example, Kipling has the Bandalog, the monkey people, and I had the ghouls, and the shape of the story is very similar. But I'm not copying Kipling. It's much more of a conversation across the ages, going, okay, you did this when you did your story about a boy in a jungle, and I'm going to do a story now about a boy in a graveyard, and hopefully come to different conclusions to the ones that you came to. But I'm also going to talk about what it means to be human, and the idea of having to go home, and the idea, that for me, the tragedy of the Jungle Book is that Mowgli doesn't get to stay in the jungle. Every kid watching it goes, but stay in the jungle, you have to stay in the jungle. And he's like, no, I have to go back and be human now. I said I wasn't, but here I am. And it's difficult for him becoming human. And
you feel like you've lost something.
Absolutely, you do.
But I have a weakness for books that shake hands across the centuries. And I think that's what the Graveyard Book and the Jungle Book do. There's another lovely question from Ria, who says, you use mythology a lot in your work. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit out here, but she's basically asking, what is it that makes those old ancient stories still so powerful? And are they still relevant to this time, the time that we're in?
I think, what makes them powerful is that they are our stories. They have all of them been honed over hundreds and thousands of years, told and retold, repurposed. I love the idea that there's not just one Ramayana. There are hundreds of Ramayanas told all around, and the Ramayana of Sri Lanka is not the same as the Ramayana of Southern India. You have these different stories that get used and reshaped. In the same way, I have never heard an audience do what an audience did when I was reading shortly after President Trump's election. I was in the town hall in New York, and I read a story, and it's the one that begins with the Norse gods deciding that to keep the frost giants out, they have to build a wall. And I got up to the bit where Odin says, we're going to build a wall. And I watched the room just collapse, and they were laughing and they were crying and they were clapping and they were cheering, and they were just, I could not carry on. I just had to wait until finally the audience came back and I read them the rest of the story. So there is I've never read anything that felt more relevant and timely than reading that 1500-year-old Norse story. But I love the way that our myths tell us about ourselves as human beings. Our myths tell us about ourselves as cultures, and our myths also tell us about what we aren't. I read a beautiful book, and I'm actually kicking myself right now, metaphorically, because I've forgotten the title and the author, and it was, I know, more and more as I get older. But it was a book of retellings of Greek myths by an Indian author who was retelling the myths of Olympus and the myths of ancient Greece from the perspective of an Indian interested in and describing them to a more Indian author and putting them in context of Indian myths. And the experience of getting to look at Greek myths through Indian eyes for me was absolutely, it was inspiring. And it showed me how powerful both sets of myths were. And the fact that, you know, we think of the ancient world as being a place where tiny groups of people stayed in their own bubbles. And the truth is, they weren't. We know that the Norse, the Vikings, you know, their best swords, because we tested the ones that they fell in battle with, came from Afghanistan. You know,
and the world feels closer, more connected.
People were traveling, and the one thing that we know about people who travel is they tell stories. And those myths and the idea of stories traveling across the ancient world is one that inspired me as a kid and still inspires me now.
I love the idea that stories last, you know, that they endure from 10 generations of human history behind, and we still understand, and we say, yes, we understand where that's coming from.
We have stories that are older than any living thing that we have. I mean, we have, you know, there's sort of, there are trees and things that may be as much as 4,500, 5,000 years old. And we have stories that are probably over 10,000 years old from the Pacific Northwest, and we can date them because they're talking about specific geological formations and volcanoes exploding, and we can date those volcanoes. There are Aboriginal stories in Australia where we're going, well, actually, they appear to be talking about this life form, this megafauna, and these guys went extinct about 40,000 years ago, which means this story has to be more than 40,000 years old. There's a power to that. The idea that you can create something that will last 40,000 years, last 10,000 years, last 5,000 years. We can't make cities that will do that, but we can do that with stories.
Okay, I've never thought of the city story comparison, but yeah, it's spine-chilling. And there's a question from Prabir Talukdar, who says, don't you believe that there is a greater need for storytelling in our education system rather than mugging up classics and doing boring things?
I have long since discovered that what you think is boring is defined by what you're actually interested in at that moment. Because if you'd asked me that question when I was 12 or 15, I would have been absolutely agreeing with you. it wasn't until I became a writer that all of a sudden things that I would have thought of as incredibly dull became incredibly interesting because I needed to know. Suddenly, I needed to understand English economic history in order to write something. I needed to understand obscure points of geography, and they became the most interesting things in the world. Even things that I would have thought of as revolting became interesting. I remember sitting there with my doctor, getting him to talk me through an autopsy, moment by moment, beat by beat, because I was going to need to write an autopsy and I needed to get it right. And I realized then, things are interesting or boring based, honestly, mostly on how interested you are and how much you want to know. For one kid, being asked to memorize a list of dinosaurs would be the worst punishment in the world. For another kid, they're going to be memorizing the lists of dinosaurs and putting together the dinosaur names and identifying dinosaurs, and there's nothing you could do to stop them. On the other hand, they may not think that history or geography or mathematics or science are interesting. And I think, yes, of course, you tell more stories. And yes, of course, we should do what we can to make school as interesting as possible for kids. And yes, of course, it's true that the most important parts of my education I got in the school library during the bits where we weren't officially being taught anything. But it's also true that it's all about what you're interested in.
We have time for 2 quick questions. Rachita wants to know, have you ever felt silly about your first draft, its untamed roots and branches? And how did you gather the courage to show it?
My first drafts are always, in my head anyway, my 0th draft. My 0th draft, it's why I love writing in handwriting if I can, because at that point, nobody ever has to see what I come up with first. And typing it up once I finished writing it is my chance to prune some of those branches, to do a little topiary. I've got to the end, I kind of know what it's about. Now I can tidy it a bit. And the truth is that being a writer is always going to involve an act of courage where you show something to somebody for the first time. And all I can suggest is you pick the people you show things to really carefully. Because if you show, when I was 23, I wrote a short story. It has a much, much longer title. I call it Forbidden Brides. But it's Forbidden Brides of the Faceless Slaves, and it keeps going. The House of Dread Desire, I think is how it finishes. And I showed this story to 2 people, an editor who I trusted and another editor whose work I liked, and one of them handed it back and said it's not very good, and the other said something much more cutting, and I put the story away. And when I thought of it, it was just with relief that I had not actually been stupid enough to get it published, because it was a terrible story, and those 2 people told me how bad it was. And then 20 years later or more, somebody asked me for a short story. And I thought, I've got that story. I'll see if I can find the carbon copy of it in the attic. Maybe there's something in there that I can rescue. And I went and found it and sat there and read it and went, you're not bad. You've got this 1 page toward the end where you're meant to be modernist fiction. Most of you is a Gothic, but then you have this one page that's meant to be contemporary literature, but when I was 23, I couldn't quite pull that off. I can pull that off now. That one's easy. So I just ran it through the typewriter and sent it out. And it went on to win awards, and it went on to do lots of fancy things. And I thought, 20-something years ago, the two people I showed it to were wrong. It was a good story. It was a good story then. And yes, it's gone on now to win awards, and it was the Locust Short Story of the Year and stuff like that. But I kind of wish I'd shown it to two people who liked or got what I was doing and could have said something encouraging back then. Because I would much rather that story was in print in 1984 than winning an award in 2005 when I already had a lot of awards. So I think so much of that is just who you show your stories to. Don't show them to people you're scared of showing them to. Show them to people who understand the kind of thing you're doing, who like the kind of thing you're doing, who can, encourage, correct, suggest, but always remember that at the end of the day, you're the author. It's going out under your name, and you get to listen to suggestions and you get to listen to what anybody says, but then you're God. Then you have to make the calls and you can reject anything. Remember that when people tell you that something doesn't work for them, they're always right. And remember that when they tell you what's wrong and how to fix it, they're normally wrong. Just, and again, be kind to yourself.
Neil, we're running out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for spending your time so generously with everyone here. And very quickly, is there one thing that you're looking forward to as a writer or as somebody who's seen so much go into adaptation? One thing that you're looking forward to in the next few years from the writing life?
I really, really want to be in an audience, surrounded by people cheering and laughing and crying, and seeing Ocean at the end of the lane at the West End somehow, because when that happens, I will know that normality has returned. I'd like to finish a novel, because if I finish a novel, I will know that a certain amount of reality has returned for me too. And more than anything else, right now, I just want to be able to hug my son, who is half a world away, and I miss him so much.
I hope that will happen. And I hope you get to hug your son. I hope you get to be surrounded by an audience. And I hope some of that audience will be in India soon, maybe next year. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you, Nilanjana. Thank you, Neil Gaiman. And yes, we hope you can get to hug your son and be the pirate, babysitting him and telling the stories that he wants to hear, and stories of empathy and love that you talked about, much needed in this time. And I think the last bit of what you said, in terms of the two people who didn't like your first story, and the folks who tell you to what you should do to fix your story. I think every writer who's listening in, and I've got so many messages, you sort of struck a chord with all of them. So thank you both so much. And, this is a conversation that's been so delayed, as Nilanjana said, 30 years in its making. We should have done it, carried on and on and on, except for our colleagues who are saying we need to bring it in. So just hang there, and thank you. We're really sorry, there were like so many questions that you all streamed through YouTube and Facebook. And we promise that at some point of time, post-COVID or during COVID or along with COVID, if COVID allows, we will try and...
I think we lost sound for a second. But I think what he was going to say before the sound was so abruptly cut off was, Neil, come to India. the moment that the first planes start up. So please do that. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.